At the beginning of 1943, when the war was already raging on many fronts, the American fleet began active work on creating new combat ships capable not only of competing with existing destroyers and aircraft carriers, but also surpassing them in speed and firepower. While most countries focused on developing new types of vessels, the United States paid special attention to designing new battleships, powerful ships with heavy armament and impressive size, capable of becoming a true force at sea. In 1938, at the very start of this period, American engineers and designers from the Navy's Construction and Repair Bureau began a thorough study and development of new combat ship options. Their goal was to create ships that could not only match the rapidly developing aircraft carriers, but also surpass the fast battleships of Japan, which at the time inspired fear and respect worldwide. These tasks required the search for new solutions, technologies, and structural designs, so a team of naval architects proposed several development scenarios. As a result, the famous Iowa-class battleships were created. These were the last American battleships of this type, and simultaneously, some of the last in the entire history of the U.S. Navy. Initially, 6 such ships were planned, but ultimately only 4 were completed. These were the ships named Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, and New Jersey. The last of them, jokingly nicknamed Big J, was commissioned in 1943. During its commissioning ceremony, the ship's commander, Captain Carl F. Holton, predicted that this battleship would become a beautiful lady who would sometimes show her anger and fury. And he was right. Over the years of service, during which this giant, measuring 887 feet in length and displacing 60,000 tons, participated in nearly all the major battles of World War II, this ship became a symbol of the strength and resilience of the American fleet. It not only served long and honorably, but also set numerous records, demonstrating remarkable versatility and steadfastness in the most difficult battles. Regarding the history of the New Jersey, its construction began in 1940, and the final decision to build it was made on July 1, 1939. This ship became one of the 4 completed Iowa-class battleships, alongside Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin. Throughout its service, its armament was continuously improved and modernized, especially the anti-aircraft systems. However, the main artillery remained unchanged. 9 16-inch guns, each 50 calibers long, mounted in 3 triple turrets. Part 2 of 45. These heavy guns fired shells weighing about 2,500 pounds, capable of penetrating armor and resisting any attacks. Initially, the ship's designers planned for a crew of 117 officers and 1,840 sailors. But as combat capabilities developed and the number of air defense systems increased, the crew size eventually reached over 2,700 sailors. This was due to the need to service numerous anti-aircraft and torpedo defense systems, which became increasingly important during the war. The New Jersey was named after the state of New Jersey and was launched exactly 1 year after the tragic attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 17, 1942, giving it a special symbolic significance. It was launched from the stern, sliding down the river, and at that moment, its bow touched the shoreline of the state it was named after. Afterwards, it was transported to a dock where construction and installation work were completed. In the state of New Jersey was one of the most powerful and famous battleships of World War II, the battleship USS New Jersey, which actively participated in numerous battles and operations in the Pacific theater of war. This ship not only struck key Japanese bases, but also escorted aircraft carriers, serving as a vital element of U.S. naval power during the war. During its combat missions, it took part in many operations across various Pacific islands, including the first large-scale aircraft carrier attack on Tokyo, where its crew successfully shot down 20 Japanese aircraft, both combat planes and kamikazes, and also assisted American pilots in distress. This ship became part of those events that entered history as some of the most significant in the naval war in the Pacific. Additionally, the USS New Jersey participated in 2 of the largest and most important battles of World War II in the Pacific. The first was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. This battle is considered the largest in history of naval combat between aircraft carriers, and it was in this battle that the USS New Jersey played a crucial role, helping to break through the formidable Japanese fleet defenses, which previously seemed impenetrable due to numerous anti-aircraft guns and air defense systems. In this battle, the American fleet defeated Japanese forces, especially their air force, which at that time was one of the strongest and most numerous. Just 3 months later, the battleship participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is regarded as the largest naval battle in history. Despite some controversial moments and extensive discussions, this battle resulted in the complete destruction of the Japanese fleet as an effective fighting force, marking a major victory for the Americans in the Pacific. This ship became the only battleship among the Iowa class to serve as the flagship of two of the greatest American admirals of that era, Captain Ray Spruance and Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey Jr. As part of the main operations of the Pacific Fleet, the New Jersey participated in various significant battles and amphibious operations. It was involved in the Battle of Formosa, landings on Peleliu, Leyte, Muro, and Luzon Islands, as well as in operations to secure control over the South China Sea. The 4 Iowa-class battleships served together as a powerful striking force in the American counteroffensive in the Pacific. Among them, the New Jersey held a special place, standing out as the most prominent and recognizable representative of this formidable fleet. After fighting enemy ships and aircraft, escorting aircraft carriers, bombarding islands, and performing numerous other combat tasks, the Big J, as sailors affectionately called her, transported thousands of American soldiers eager to return to the mainland. However, in the post-war period, when the war ended and peace began to restore, the need for such massive warships diminished in favor of other priorities. As a result, in 1948, the New Jersey was decommissioned and placed into reserve. Unlike many other combat ships of that time, which were dismantled and sold for scrap, the Department of Defense decided to preserve the Iowa-class battleships in case their power and capabilities would be needed again. Thus, in 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, the situation required urgent action. The United States, under the initiative of the United Nations, quickly prepared its forces for intervention. At that moment, the New Jersey was reactivated from reserve status to become part of the active combat fleet. In November of that year, according to several naval officers, during 2 of its service deployments in the waters off the Korean peninsula, she demonstrated some of the most impressive gunnery skills they had ever seen. These skills were displayed while she was part of the Navy's mobile artillery unit, called Seashore. During the days of combat operations, her ability to fire accurately and powerfully was admired by all present. In July 1950, on her final combat mission, she successfully destroyed several North Korean bunkers hidden in caves and trenches, as well as large-caliber guns along the coastline. Just a few days later, the conflict ended, and a long period of peace began. At that time, the New Jersey was decommissioned and placed into the reserve fleet, or so-called mothball fleet, on August 21, 1950, where she remained for over 10 years. When this bloody war in Vietnam reached its peak, American aviation losses became truly catastrophic. In this regard, on May 21, 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara issued a directive to conduct a special investigation. The goal of this work was to find a way to reduce pilot fatalities while ensuring the necessary volume of ammunition to sustain combat operations. The answer came in August of the same year, when McNamara decided to reactivate the ship for combat readiness. He chose to return the USS New Jersey to the Pacific Fleet to strengthen naval gunfire support in Vietnam. This ship was intended to become a reliable means of bombing coastal targets, day and night, in any weather, whether rain or sunshine, without risking aircraft and pilots. Moreover, while North Vietnam's arsenal mainly consisted of tactical aircraft and a few torpedo boats, they virtually lacked the means to inflict serious damage on a battleship. The USS New Jersey was an ideal choice for this mission, as it was in much better condition than its fleet sister ships, thanks to extensive modernization and thorough maintenance carried out before its second commissioning. As a result, on March 26, 1968, the ship was officially reintroduced into the armed forces under the command of Captain John Edward Snyder. After returning to service, it underwent another modernization, during which advanced electronic systems were installed, a helicopter landing pad was created, and the guns were replaced and upgraded to better target objects within Vietnam. At that time, the USS New Jersey was the only active battleship in the world, and its arrival off the coast of Southeast Asia took place on September 29, 1968. The very next day, it fired its first shots in over 16 years, launching 29 16-inch shells toward targets in northern Vietnam, in the demilitarized zone near the 45th parallel. During its stay in the conflict zone, the ship traveled along the entire coastline and relieved American tactical aviation forces from the need to perform separate combat missions close to the shore. Additionally, the USS New Jersey and its crew responded to help calls from ground forces and the Marine Corps, such as the 101st Airborne Division, as well as the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions and the 173rd Airborne Brigade. In 1969, one of the most powerful but already outdated combat ships was finally decommissioned. This gigantic ship remained inactive for many years until the early 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan launched a large-scale program to rebuild the American Navy, known as the 600-ship fleet. This initiative aimed to restore the U.S. naval forces after significant cuts that occurred following the end of the Vietnam War. The strategy of creating a powerful and numerous fleet became one of Reagan's main campaign promises in 1981. He advocated for building a large fleet capable of countering Soviet naval strength. As part of this program, all 4 Iowa-class battleships were brought out of mothballs and fully modernized with the installation of modern weaponry and electronic systems. Thus, the USS New Jersey and her battle companions were re-equipped to defend the country in the late Cold War era. These ships received new armaments and navigation systems, enabling them to perform missions under tense Cold War conditions. Subsequently, these ships participated multiple times in various operations, including missions in Lebanon and the Persian Gulf. However, by the late 1980s, it became clear that the threat from the Soviet Union had significantly diminished, and it was evident that large ships like battleships no longer met the requirements of modern warfare. As a result, the USS Missouri, one of these ships, was decommissioned in the 4th and, as expected, the last time. This battleship was more actively engaged in service than its sister ships, serving just over 21 years. This was approximately 2.5 times longer than the Iowa and 5 years longer than the USS Missouri, nearly a decade longer than the USS Wisconsin. Moreover, this ship is considered the most decorated battleship in U.S. Navy history. During its service, it received a total of 19 combat and campaign awards. While Russia, after the Russo-Japanese War, began actively strengthening its territories in the Far East, recognizing their vulnerability, it started constructing powerful defensive structures. By the start of World War II, Russian naval defenses were well prepared and capable of effectively countering the old enemies who once threatened Russian shores. An important element of this system was the fortress built in the city of Vladivostok, a major seaport in eastern Russia. This fortification complex was called the Vladivostok Fortress and became a source of admiration for allies and respect for enemies. It was a modern structure consisting of a network of interconnected fortifications, artillery batteries, and powder magazines. Construction of this formidable defensive complex was completed in the 1930s. One of its main parts was the Vasilevsky Battery, which was built on the basis of modified main guns from the ancient ship Pavel. These guns were given a new life and installed on mountain positions, protecting the city and its surroundings. The city of Vladivostok itself, which means ruler of the East, is located approximately 9,334 kilometers east of Moscow. However, this region, situated in the northern part of the Pacific Ocean, had long been at the center of territorial disputes between various powers. The island directly opposite the peninsula became part of the Russian Empire only after China ceded it by agreement, known as the Ping Treaty in 1862. As part of the so-called Outer Manchuria, this territory was renamed Risky Island, or in Russian, Russian Island. Additionally, this fortress was situated on key elevated positions along the main line of defense for both the island and the entire country. It was on these strategically important sites that fortifications were built to ensure reliable protection against potential enemy attacks. It soon became clear that such structures would be especially valuable in fighting a specific adversary, the Japanese. When the Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904, the Japanese fleet immediately launched active operations off the coast of this region. In an interview, the well-known author and historian Vladimir Henin stated that, quoting him, "The Japanese cruiser fleet arrived here. These were armored cruisers armed with 203mm caliber guns. At that time, it was freezing weather, minus 31 degrees Celsius, and the frozen bay hindered maneuvering of the Japanese ships. They began shelling the eastern part of the city, where military workshops, batteries, and fortifications under construction were located. However, the Japanese did not even attempt to pass through the eastern Bosphorus, the narrow strait between Russian Island and the Morav Peninsula. This was due to their confidence that such a risky maneuver would be too dangerous. Since then, Russian Island has become part of legends and stories. Ultimately, after the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, a peace treaty was signed, under which Russia was forced to cede rights to the Lung Peninsula and the port of Qingdao. Additionally, the country lost the southern branch of the Eastern Chinese Railway and Sakhalin Island in the south. Russia was also required to grant the Japanese fishing rights in its waters under very unfavorable conditions. At that time, the only naval base in the Pacific Ocean was the military base located on Voisky Island, which was also the only well-equipped trading port in the Far East. The significance of this fortress was undeniable, as it served as an important strategic point. However, the state of its structures was less than ideal. In the subsequent decades, efforts to restore the fortifications faced numerous obstacles. It all began with revolutionary protests and armed clashes in the Bush area immediately after Russia's defeat in the war with Japan. Then, during the years of World War I and the Russian Revolution, the restoration was almost completely halted, as resources, materials, weapons, and personnel were urgently needed elsewhere. Over time, the structure of the fortress continued to deteriorate and decay. Only in the 1930s, under the communist regime, did the threat from neighboring states reemerge. After 30 years of historical shame before the Japanese, during which Russia suffered significant losses, the Soviet authorities were forced to prepare to defend their borders in the Pacific Ocean. This time, unlike in previous years, there was no ice that could hinder the invaders, and the country was preparing for a possible attack. Russian Island was a geographically very advantageous location for strengthening defenses, as its protruding part was directly in the path of approaching enemy fleet. In this regard, Admiral Dmitry proposed an idea to install powerful artillery on the island to ensure its protection. The plan involved using an old, heavily damaged warship, which still had usable guns. The old battleship Pava, the second in the gun gut class of cruisers, the first in the history of the Russian fleet of armored cruisers, was chosen as such a vessel. This ship became the seventh of 7 ships named after Russia's victory over Sweden in 1709. It was built at Admiral Taya's shipyard in St. Petersburg. Its keel was laid in June 1909, and 2 years later, in June 1911, the ship was launched. Subsequently, by 1920, the vessel was fully completed, brought to combat readiness, and prepared for its missions. This warship was named Poltava and was intended to defend the Gulf of Finland's entrance from potential attacks by German forces. However, despite all plans, the enemy never attempted to penetrate this strategic area, and ultimately, Poltava was converted into a training ship. Additionally, it served as cover during mine-laying operations, which was very important at the time. In March 1918, most of the Baltic Fleet left the area, and Poltava was placed under repair and remained idle due to crew shortages. Then in November of the same year, the ship experienced a serious fire that broke out in its forward boiler room. The fire destroyed a significant part of the vessel's interior space. Over the next 20 years, numerous proposals were made for the ship's restoration and even modernization, but none of them were ever realized. During this time, Poltava was used as a source of spare parts for its sister ships and also served as a barracks vessel. It was believed that the ship could no longer be saved and would never again become an independent combat vessel. Ultimately, the Russian fleet saw an opportunity to extract still operational guns from it for the defense of Vladivostok. Several kilometers from Novik Bay, in the southern part of Russky Island, is battery number 98081, better known as Vashalov Battery. This site defended the fortress of Vladivostok, armed with batteries of 105mm caliber. However, considering the strength of Japanese ships, these guns proved insufficient for city defense. Vladimir Kalin explained that Japanese warships could easily withstand fire from lighter guns and continue shelling the city with impunity. Therefore, the powerful guns from the Poltava were transported to the island and named after the People's Commissar of Defense, Clem Barashilov, who actively supported the development of defensive structures. In 1931, the Soviet Revolutionary Army approved a plan to create a coastal defense system that would be impossible to detect from the sea. Construction began in 1932 and lasted for 2 years. Using the natural features of the terrain, engineers created a formidable defensive system. The battery was completed in record time, which was considered a true engineering miracle. Structurally, the complex consisted of 2 towers connected by an underground corridor 250 meters long. Only the towers were visible externally, while inside there were 5 floors of underground buildings extending to a depth of 15 meters. Their concrete vaults had a thickness of over 3 meters, capable of withstanding explosions of bombs weighing up to 1 ton dropped from the air. At the same time, triple guns of 52 caliber, 305 millimeter length, with a firing range of up to 35 kilometers, were mounted on the towers. About 400 personnel were required to operate the entire battery, although one tower could function with a minimal crew of 75 men. Historian and writer Oleg Stravsky noted that Russian warships surpassed enemy ships in rate of fire. He called this the era of mechanics combined with electronics, the so-called golden age of technology. The ships used electric motors and proven mechanical control systems, which served as backup measures. Today, for example, a tower weighing over 9 tons. Unlike other large naval batteries located around the world, the Berezhskaya battery served much longer than many of its counterparts. It remained operational until the collapse of the Soviet Union and even after continuing to perform its functions. At the same time, the Pava battery was quickly dismantled shortly after the war ended, but its tower and guns remained in service until the early 2000s. The guns were last used in combat in 1992, and soon after they were decommissioned. Despite their exceptional shooting accuracy, with deviations not exceeding 1.5 meters, their combat capability in the 1990s was not a priority for Russia. At that time, the country was experiencing severe economic hardships, and as a result, the Navy could not even provide dry rations for its soldiers on the island, which led to the tragic death of at least 4 people. On the other hand, the Soviet Union could have kept stationary guns in combat readiness, but with the development of research into coastal anti-ship missile systems in the 1950s, such batteries gradually lost their primary significance. They became more of a part of the defense system, serving as an additional threat. Maintaining and supporting existing guns within the Soviet economic system was significantly cheaper than their complete replacement. That is why the command sought to keep them operational to be prepared for any unforeseen situations. Nevertheless, this coastal fortress never fired a shot during the war. The very presence of its guns served as a signal to the enemy that they were at a disadvantage. Ironically, it was their silence and non-intervention that helped achieve success. In 1995, this complex was recognized as a monument of history and culture. About 3 years later, the Pacific Fleet Naval History Museum opened in Vladivostok, where visitors could view this and many other exhibits. Across Russia, Poltava is still affectionately called the longest battleship in the world. This legend is associated with the era of the First World War. Despite Germany's significant successes on the continent, its powerful fleet on the open sea continued to remain in ports under the control of the larger and stronger Royal Navy fleet. After the British Admiralty entrusted Admiral Reinhard Scheer with command, he decided to carry out a daring plan to break the blockade. His idea was to divide the British squadron into smaller groups, lure them into a trap, and destroy them before larger forces could intervene. Scheer ordered his first reconnaissance squadron, commanded by Franz Hipper, to go out to sea to the north to lure Sir David Beatty's battlecruiser fleet beyond the ports. At the same time, he planned to keep the main forces under Sir John Jellicoe's command in reserve, so they would not interfere in this conflict. When Hipper engaged in battle, he was supposed to retreat quickly to the south, with Beatty pursuing him, which would lead the British fleet directly into the trap. He planned to deliver an unexpected and powerful blow to the British fleet, which until then had been Germany's main opponent at sea. On May 31, 1916, Scheer successfully lured the Beatty fleet into northern waters. However, he was unaware that the British had managed to intercept and decode his messages. This meant he would face the full might of the Royal Navy. The ensuing battle became the last major naval confrontation primarily involving warships, battleships and cruisers. 2 years had passed since the start of World War I, and until that moment, large-scale naval battles had been rare. This battle would forever be remembered as one of the most significant maritime clashes, where the fate of the fleets was at stake. The Germans understood well that their distant naval fleet was inferior in numbers to the British Grand Fleet, which had centuries-old traditions of tactical naval combat and often achieved victory through experience and skill. At the same time, Britain believed that as long as the German fleet did not pose an immediate threat to their sea routes and merchant ships, there was no point in risking efforts to destroy it. In case of active hostilities, there was a danger that German submarines, which the British called U-boats, could strike back and cause significant damage. Therefore, strategically, the German fleet was hesitant to leave its ports, leaving the main efforts to combat the British to their submarines. Conversely, the British did not take aggressive action against German ships, keeping them confined within their own waters to avoid provoking the Germans into more decisive measures. The German plan was to gradually reduce the number of British warships with the help of their U-boats. They hoped that by whittling down the British fleet piece by piece, their own fleet could strike a decisive blow on the open sea and completely destroy it. However, by that time, the British no longer perceived German submarines as an immediate threat and saw no need to deploy their entire Grand Fleet at once to combat the U-boats. They preferred to keep the fleet in reserve and avoid unnecessary risks, preventing the Germans from launching a surprise attack. The situation only began to change when a new fleet commander was appointed, Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, who replaced the more cautious Admiral Hugo von Pohl. It was under Scheer that the threat to maritime peace emerged, as he sought ways to deliver a sudden and powerful blow to the British fleet. He understood that he could not confront the full strength of the Royal Navy directly, so he devised a clever plan: to lure a smaller part of the British ships into open water and destroy them before the rest of the forces could come to their aid. Part 11 of 45. Scheer's first step was to divide the massive Grand Fleet, which consisted of numerous warships. To do this, he organized an attack on the ports of Loughton and Great Yarmouth, which took place on April 25, 1916. This daring and aggressive move was intended to provoke a reaction from the British. And, as Scheer anticipated, British Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, commanding the main fleet, sent the 5th Battlecruiser Squadron from the main base on the island of Scapa Flow in Scotland southward to reinforce the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons under Admiral Sir David Beatty at Rosyth. It was this reinforced fleet that Scheer aimed to lure into a trap and destroy before the British could intervene. At that time, Beatty's forces included 6 battlecruisers and 4 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. When the enemy fleet was already moving south, Scheer launched the second phase of the operation, sending Vice Admiral Franz von Hipper, head of the German fleet's reconnaissance group, into action. His force comprised the battlecruisers Lützow, Deringer, Zeditz, Maltka, and Vandertram, as well as 4 light cruisers heading north along the Norwegian coast. The main idea was to force Beatty's forces, which were approaching, to pursue Hipper and his group. Scheer hoped that his reconnaissance would lure the British into a trap, and at the moment they engaged, the entire main German fleet, its powerful squadron, would suddenly appear on the horizon and deliver a devastating blow. He planned to follow at a distance of about 50 miles behind the reconnaissance group, ready to join the fight and destroy the enemy at the right moment. Jellicoe was immediately informed of the developments, and even before Hipper's reconnaissance group left port, the entire Grand Fleet had already set sail. It was rushing at full speed, rapidly heading toward the rendezvous point with Beatty's fleet, which was supposed to be near the entrance to the Skagerrak Strait, in the area where the Germans planned to attack them. It was expected that only after midnight, or rather around 1 o'clock the next day, May 31st, Hipper's reconnaissance would go to sea, leading a force of more than 100 ships carrying approximately 45,000 officers and sailors. None of the participants suspected that their plan to lure the enemy into a trap would be disrupted by a sudden ambush involving over 150 ships and 60,000 men. A battle that would later become the largest naval engagement in human history. By 1:30 p.m. on May 31st, both fleets were moving directly toward each other on a collision course, with neither side realizing how close they were to a clash. At that moment, Hipper could not determine whether his northern maneuver had successfully attracted Beatty's fleet to the intended location or not. At this time, the British were confident that their attempt to sail the sea in hopes of discovering German ships would prove yet another fruitless effort. Their confidence was reinforced by the fact that Jellicoe received a message confirming that signals from the German flagship were still audible from the Abusin port, indicating that the German ships had not yet moved from their position and that their plan remained in effect. At 2:20 p.m., both fleets observed smoke rising from a small vessel in the distance. Both sides sent torpedo boats to scout, and although it was eventually determined to be a Dutch merchant ship, the observers spotted each other, and shouts of "enemy in sight" were heard on both sides. At this time, the main body of the British Grand Fleet was approximately 60 miles north of the Batty position, and initially the Germans believed they had the advantage in this confrontation. As the torpedo boats began engaging each other, Gipper and Batty directed their main warships toward the collision site. By 3:20 p.m., both fleets had formed into lines facing each other, ready to open fire. Soon, Gipper's flagship, the battleship Lutro, began shelling the British ships. It was already too late to retreat. In the initial phase of the battle, the German fleet demonstrated significantly greater shooting accuracy compared to the British. The latter suffered heavily from poor marksmanship, as most of their shells missed their targets, flying over the German ships. Meanwhile, the Germans delivered hit after hit, inflicting substantial damage on Batty's forces. The ships Lion, Princess Royal, and Tiger repeatedly took hits, and some, such as the damaged Inditag, quickly capsized and sank under the pressure of 2 salvos from the Van der Tonn ship. Subsequently, the 5th Battlecruiser Squadron, which had remained behind during the initial maneuver, joined the line of British ships, and its heavy guns delivered such devastating blows to the German cruisers that German torpedo boats were forced to maneuver between the two fleets to divert some of the fire onto themselves. Despite this, the German ships continued to demonstrate remarkable shooting accuracy, and soon the British battlecruiser Queen Mary exploded with a powerful blast in its main powder magazine, marking the end of that ship. As the battle reached its peak and fierce clashes continued unabated, south of Batty's main forces, a British light cruiser squadron observed the approach of the main German fleet. These ships, part of the high seas forces, were moving toward the combat front, and their appearance was perceived as an ominous sign. At this time, after receiving information about the full involvement of the German fleet in the battle, the commander of the British squadron, Captain Batty, made a decision regarding the tactics that would change the course of events. He immediately began to retreat from his position to create the illusion of withdrawal, which led the German fleet to believe that the British were retreating, while in fact he was luring them northward, directly into a trap prepared by the strength and numbers of the British forces. At such a critical moment, the situation became especially dangerous. Visibility sharply deteriorated, the fog thickened, and at that time, the ship Jellicoe, located about 40 nautical miles from Beatty's position, continued moving in 6 columns, unaware of the exact location of the enemy. He understood that without precise information about the German fleet's position, he would not be able to take decisive action in time and choose the optimal tactics. That is why he was in urgent need of information that could help him determine when and how to form a unified battle line to strike the enemy most effectively. In desperation, as the situation grew more tense, Jellicoe suddenly received a radio message from Captain Batty, reporting the position and direction of the German fleet. This call became a decisive moment in the entire battle, as it provided Jellicoe with the crucial information. Based on this, he made the most important decision. He ordered his main combat formation to deploy in a line along the left flank to take advantage of the last faint light and simultaneously block the retreat route of the German ships, especially Scheer's ships. This was a strategically vital decision that changed the course of the battle. When the last British warship took its place in the line, the fog slightly lifted, and the command saw the German fleet moving directly toward them. At that moment, about 100 German warships were ready to open fire on the British forces. This moment became a true victory for Jellicoe, as he managed to force the German fleet to use only their forward guns, continuing to approach the British trap. Soon, a barrage of fire and destruction rained down on the German ships, which was meant to crush their forces. However, thanks to the sturdy construction of the German vessels and the shortcomings of British ammunition, the German fleet was not destroyed instantly. Some ships, including the famous HMS Invincible, were disabled, but the German ships managed to organize a retreat maneuver, destroying the British ship Invincible before withdrawing. This maneuver was executed perfectly. German torpedo ships launched smoke screens to conceal Scheur's retreat, while the British remained puzzled, watching the German fleet withdraw, having lost only a few ships. In an unexpected turn of events, Scheur suddenly decided to turn back and attack the main British fleet again. Debates about the reason for this move still continue. Some believe it was a mistake, an attempt to encircle the British forces, while others think he wanted to deliver additional strikes. In any case, this decision quickly turned against him. The British fleet immediately opened fire on the German ships, and several of them were sunk. Realizing their mistake, Scheur ordered a second retreat, but this time their withdrawal was chaotic and disorganized. Many German ships began to leave without waiting for orders, under the pressure of British firepower. At a critical moment, torpedo boats played a decisive role, rushing at the British ships and sacrificing themselves to enable the German fleet to escape. Meanwhile, the main British fleet in the North Sea, washing the shores of Germany, remained in German hands, while the British Grand Fleet achieved victories in naval battles. However, this victory came at a high cost. The movement and strength of both sides proved to be too costly. The British lost significantly more ships and sailors than the Germans. During the battle, 3 cruisers, 3 battlecruisers, and 8 destroyers were sunk, compared to 1 German battleship, 1 battlecruiser, 4 light cruisers, and 5 torpedo boats. As a result, British losses were more than twice as high as German losses. Although Britain claimed victory, the Germans also declared their own, since the outcome of the battle was not unequivocal. The result had a profound impact on the German fleet, which had to remain in port for an extended period, while the British fleet was ready for new campaigns just 4 days after the battle. At the beginning of World War II, Norway remained a neutral country and did not allow Allied forces to cross its territory to assist Finland during the Soviet invasion in 1939. Meanwhile, France and Britain developed a plan known as Plan R4. This plan involved a major military operation to seize Norway. Upon learning of this plan, Hitler decided to preempt his opponents and be the first to capture Norwegian ports. Soon after, the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, headed toward Norwegian ports under the guise of friendly forces, but with one clear demand: that the local fleet in the strategic city of Narvik surrender all its warships. However, this hasty move revealed Germany's true intentions. Shortly after arriving in Narvik, the British Navy seized the opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to the German fleet. As a result, Europe was shaken. Germany invaded Poland, forcing France and Britain to declare war on Hitler. In this chaos, the Soviet Union actively intervened, taking advantage of the situation and attacking Finland, initiating the brutal Winter War. Amidst all these events, Norway held a special place. Despite pressure and threats, it decided to remain neutral and avoid bloodshed. For the Allies, this stance became a real problem. Without Norwegian support, it was impossible to aid Finland, and moreover, vital sources of iron ore for Germany were located in Norwegian mines. Part 15 of 45. To disrupt the iron supplies that fueled the Wehrmacht, Britain and France devised a clever plan. They intended to request permission to send expeditionary forces through Norwegian territory into Finland. However, upon arrival, the Allies planned to seize Norwegian mines and control over the country's strategic resources. Before the war, most of the iron supplied to Germany came from French mines in the Lorraine region. But after the invasion of Poland, Norway became Germany's main source of iron ore. If the Allies could cut off these supplies, they could deprive Germany of vital resources for war. However, the Norwegians were well aware that the Allies might attempt to seize their industrial facilities and refuse to allow foreign troops on their territory. In response, the Allies openly threatened that, if refused, they could seize the mines by force. Hitler took these threats very seriously, especially after the Altmark incident, when Britain demonstrated its willingness to ignore Norwegian neutrality to achieve its goals. At the moment when decisive action was needed, he decided to strike first. On April 29, 1940, German forces launched an attack on Denmark and Norway. There were very few warning signs, and the Norwegian authorities underestimated the threat already looming over their country. A few hours before the invasion began, on April 8th, the German secret combat ship Rio de Janeiro was sunk off the coast of Lillesand by the Polish submarine Orso, part of the 2nd Submarine Squadron of the Royal Navy. That same night, the Norwegian Coast Guard spotted an approaching German ship, after which they opened fire, destroying its crew and captain. Time was moving very quickly, and the situation on the front was rapidly deteriorating. The invading forces made swift progress, and Norway's attempts to defend its territory proved nearly unsuccessful. Despite initial efforts, the Norwegian Air Force faced overwhelming numbers of German aircraft. Only 5 fighters against more than 80 enemy combat planes. Soon, German troops carried out the first successful parachute landing in history. They deployed their airborne units at Furter Airfield in Oslo, as well as at the Christiania Airfield in Kivik and at the military air base in Sola. Despite the enemy's overwhelming superiority, the defenders continued to resist. On the night of April 8th to 9 at the Oscarborg fortress, Norwegians fought a fierce battle to stop the German vessel, Bluka. At that moment, 2 powerful German guns, each 48 years old, were deployed in defense. They fired upon the German fleet, inflicting significant damage and hindering its advance. Ultimately, due to the narrow fjord, the German ships had to abandon their attempts to break through, and Bluka was sunk. The German command was surprised by the resilience of the Norwegian defenders. They did not immediately understand whether the damage to their ships was caused by gunfire from the shore or by mines laid in the area. As a result, the German ships decided to suspend further naval advances to give the Norwegian royal family, government, and deputies time to evacuate. During this retreat, Norwegian forces witnessed the Battle of Midskog and the artillery shelling of Elvarg and Nibiron. Despite the difficulties, they managed to survive these trials and organize a government in exile, which found refuge in the United Kingdom. At the same time, Norwegian military leader and Nazi sympathizer Vibeke Quisling attempted to seize power in the country. Through a radio address, he announced the creation of a Norwegian Nazi government, while a full-scale invasion was underway. In less than 24 hours, German forces captured strategic ports and facilities in Bergen, Stavanger, Edgersand, Kristiansand, Arendal, Hortong, and Trondheim. Meanwhile, Norwegian coastal defense ships, the armored and minesweeping vessels Nora and Elsvold, tried to defend the port of Narvik. However, the strength of the German Navy proved too great, and shortly after the attack began, the ships were sunk. The overall success of the German operation to seize Norway was significant. Almost all local defensive forces collapsed. Nevertheless, not everything went according to plan. The long journey to Narvik was complicated by the fact that Germany had prepared and sent at least 3 tankers by sea in advance, intended for refueling the fleet before the invasion. Fueling with a single military vessel was a very lengthy and complex process, requiring considerable time and effort. During the first attack, the British fleet made several attempts to intercept the ship carrying fuel, the so-called Kriegsmarine, but all these attempts failed. Despite this, the British fleet commander, Commodore Bernard Warburg-Lee, who led the second destroyer, Flotilla, already knew where the German warships were located. Moreover, he suspected that the German ships were likely low on fuel, giving him a certain advantage. As a result, Flotilla headed toward the port of Narvik with the aim of delivering a surprise and crushing blow to the German fleet and destroying it. This plan was very risky and complex, as only 5 British destroyers, Hardy, Husper, Havoc, Hunter, and Hostale, were available for its implementation. Additionally, according to Norwegian pilots, 6 German destroyers were in the port, and the command hoped that the element of surprise and an unexpected attack would help level the odds in the battle. Early in the morning of April 10th, the flotilla approached Narvik, hiding in a dense snowstorm. At that moment, British ships suddenly emerged from the fog and launched a swift attack on 2 German vessels that were refueling at the only tanker, Jan Velum. This marked the beginning of the first naval battle at Narvik. German destroyers Hermann Kühne and Hans Ludermann, which were anchored nearby the Jan Velum, suddenly found themselves under a barrage of fire from the approaching British ships emerging from the fog. They were completely unprepared for combat and could have quickly found themselves at the bottom if help had not arrived. Fortunately for the crew of Kriegsmarine, a larger German force was already present in the port area, prompting the British fleet to quickly shift their tactics to ambush the incoming destroyers. However, due to poor organization and insufficient speed, the German ships failed to quickly take up combat positions, and the British soon gained the advantage. 5 British destroyers, Hardy, Hotspur, Havoc, Hunter, and Hostile, launched a coordinated strike, destroying the destroyers Wilhelm Held and Anton Schmidt within minutes, and seriously damaging Derwin Roeder, while 2 other ships, which were refueling at the time, sustained minor damage. Meanwhile, on land, German troops began responding with gunfire at the approaching British destroyers, forcing the ships at sea to retreat. They lacked landing forces capable of neutralizing the German infantry on shore, so the British command was forced to abandon further landing attempts. Despite this, Hostile launched a torpedo attack against cargo ships in the port, successfully destroying 11 vessels, 6 of them German, 1 British, 2 Swedish, and 2 Norwegian. According to reports, the British managed to disable 5 of the 6 German destroyers in the region. At this time, Vorbert and Lee's command mistakenly believed there were only 6 destroyers in Narvik, when in fact there were 10. As the British ships were leaving the port, they were suddenly attacked by German destroyers Wolfen Zanar, Erik Conger, and Erik Giza, which unexpectedly emerged from the Herjängs Fjord to the north, leading to Narvik. They were joined by 2 more German destroyers, George Teal and Barr. Surprised and with very limited ammunition, the British ships found themselves in a difficult situation, having to fight against 5 fully armed and combat-ready German destroyers. The situation at sea became critical. Every moment could be the last. At this time, a second ship, called Flotilla, engaged in a prolonged battle with the 3 initial German destroyers, attempting to hold back their assault. However, the situation worsened when 2 more German destroyers, coming from Bangang Bay, appeared on the flank. In this difficult situation, Captain Warburton Lee and his crew displayed courage and resilience, fighting desperately and refusing to give the enemy an easy victory. An intense naval battle was brewing, during which German ships surrounded the British vessels from all sides, and this encirclement proved to be highly destructive. As a result, the Fatul sustained serious damage that made further operation impossible, and unfortunately, Captain Warburton Lee was killed in action. The rest of the crew decided to abandon the damaged ship on shore to save the team and preserve lives. Losing their flagship, the combat capability and morale of the second ship sharply declined. Soon after, the British ship Hunt was hit by German torpedoes and sank within minutes, losing all its combat purpose. At the same time, Hotspur was also struck by enemy torpedoes, which seriously undermined its combat effectiveness and ability to continue fighting. In circumstances where victory seemed increasingly unattainable, the remnants of the British forces began to withdraw from the battle. Despite the damage inflicted on them and fuel exhaustion, the German destroyers chose not to pursue the fleeing opponents. They decided not to chase the retreating British, realizing that pursuit was pointless. Ultimately, despite heavy losses, the second flotilla inflicted significant damage on the enemy, and this heroic battle became an important chapter in naval warfare history. For his bravery and self-sacrifice, Captain Warburton Lee was posthumously awarded the highest honor, the Victoria Cross. The other ships of the Kriegsmarine series barely had time to rejoice in victory because in response to the events, the Royal Fleet immediately sent the mighty battleship Vors Spate and 9 more destroyers into the fight. Over the next few days, these forces broke through to Narvik to continue what Warburton Lee had started and to finish the battle with the German fleet. At a time when World War II was reaching its dramatic conclusion, an American battleship, the Missouri, forever entered the history of the U.S. Navy. It was there as America took its final steps toward the Japanese islands, supporting the landing of troops on Eniwetok and Okinawa. When preparations for testing atomic bombs were already underway, in the sky and on land, the Missouri left no chance for the enemy, delivering devastating strikes to the heart of Japan and forcing the empire to surrender under the might of the American fleet. After atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese emperor finally decided to capitulate. It was on the Missouri that the peace treaty was signed. The official agreement to cease hostilities was concluded on its deck. After the war ended, and with the era of battleships behind us, many believed that this ship would be decommissioned and left unnoticed. However, years later, it was restored, refitted, and armed with Tomahawk missiles so that it could participate in new conflicts. By the 1930s, it became clear that a major world conflict was imminent. The Japanese Empire, full of ambitions and a desire for expansion, was a significant concern. Specifically, American strategists during World War II concluded that, in order to successfully accomplish their missions, the U.S. Navy needed to be prepared for active operations in the Central Pacific. They assumed that ships heading into this zone would follow long communication and logistical routes, which could be vulnerable to the swift and maneuverable Japanese fleet armed with powerful fast cruisers. The main concern was that traditional American battleships, capable of only 21 knots, responded too slowly to the rapid maneuvers of Japanese forces. These ships could not quickly engage Japanese formations, jeopardizing the fulfillment of their objectives. At the same time, faster aircraft carriers with their escort cruisers could find themselves at a disadvantage against the superiority of Japanese Kongo-class cruisers, which had recently been upgraded to fast battleship standards. The U.S. Navy faced the necessity of developing a new type of ship capable of reaching speeds of at least 30 knots to effectively counter large Japanese warships with heavy artillery. Thus, despite the Admiral's preference for slower, well-armored, and heavily armed ships, there was an urgent demand for more speedy combat vessels. The result of this need was the development of the Iowa-class battleships, a family of 6 fast battleships that, thanks to the provisions of the Second London Naval Treaty, gained advantages in speed and firepower. These ships were designed to intercept and neutralize Japanese Kongo-class cruisers, which posed a serious threat. Among this family, the USS Missouri was the most significant. It was the 4th Iowa-class battleship built by the U.S. Navy. Its construction order was signed on June 22, 1940, and it was launched on June 29, 1944. Subsequently, in 1942, the construction of 2 more ships of the same class, USS Illinois and USS Kentucky, was started. However, these ships were never completed. As events developed, their construction was halted and the hulls dismantled. Thus, Missouri became the last American battleship to be fully designed, built, and commissioned into the U.S. Navy. The USS Missouri departed from San Francisco on December 14, 1944. The ship headed to the Ellis Islands, located in the Caroline Islands, where it served as a temporary headquarters for Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher. Immediately after that, he joined a fast aircraft carrier group serving as an escort for the American aircraft carriers, which in January of the following year launched a large-scale air attack on Tokyo. Later in February, Missouri provided support to American troops during the landing on Iwo Jima. In this operation, the ship acted as a guard, providing cover and defense. During the combat, it proved to be a reliable platform for air defense, shooting down several Japanese aircraft, which significantly enhanced the safety of the landing force. Afterward, the ship headed to the Sea of Japan, where the heavily damaged aircraft carrier Franklin was located. During the days when the enemy attack on the Japanese ship continued, Missouri and its group entered the combat zone to facilitate the retreat of the damaged vessels and allow them to leave the dangerous area safely. In March, the ship was temporarily assigned to a group known as Task Force 959, along with its sister ships USS New Jersey and USS Wisconsin. As part of this group, it participated in shelling the southern coast of Okinawa, where the Japanese had established a fierce defense. The survival after the kamikaze attack became a significant event for the American forces, as the Missouri continued to provide substantial support to the fleet attacking Okinawa. As time went on and summer months arrived, Missouri had to move toward the coast of the main Japanese islands to continue striking at Tokyo, the war-torn capital. During this period, American forces intensified their operations, and on August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. After this powerful display of American military strength, rumors spread in the sea that Japanese forces were on the verge of capitulation. These rumors were soon confirmed. Just 6 days later, on August 21st, the Japanese officially surrendered. At this historic moment, Missouri participated in the process of landing 200 American officers on Japanese soil, with the aim of demilitarizing the country and bringing an end to hostilities. 2 days later, the crew was informed that their ship would be the site of the capitulation ceremony, an event that later became one of the most significant in recent history. The crew of the Missouri was thrilled. They immediately began preparations, thoroughly cleaning and painting the ship to ensure it looked its best, as all eyes of the world were on it. The long-awaited date arrived, September 2nd. On this day, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Army General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, as well as Japanese representatives led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, boarded the Missouri. Together, they signed the Act of Japan's Surrender, marking the end of World War II. After the combat operations, the USS Missouri became an important naval asset, carrying out diplomatic missions and demonstrating the strength of the American fleet around the world. However, by the late 1940s, the situation in the U.S. Navy began to change. Due to the high costs of maintaining Iowa-class battleships and their obsolescence in an era dominated by aircraft carriers, these ships were among the first to be decommissioned. Despite this, President Harry Truman firmly refused to allow the Missouri to be retired. Ignoring the advice of Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson, Secretary of the Navy John Elm Sullivan, and Chief of Naval Operations Louis E. Denfeld, he ordered the ship to remain in service because of its immense symbolic significance for the country and the armed forces. However, fate had other plans. On the morning of January 17, 1950, the Missouri, the last remaining American battleship in service, departed from Hampton Roads for a training cruise. After only a short distance, about 1 mile and 66 feet, the ship ran aground near the Tumble Shoal Lighthouse, located close to the Old Comfort Point. It had entered shallow waters at high speed and was lifted more than 7 feet above the waterline. At that moment, the hull collided with the remains of another sunken vessel, puncturing its hull and becoming lodged inside. The incident occurred during an especially high tide, which significantly complicated and made risky the attempt to free the Missouri. Assistance from tugs, pontoons, shore equipment, and, of course, a rising water level was required. After 2 weeks of persistent work and special operations, the ship was freed and subsequently taken for repairs. During this time, as the world was embroiled in another major conflict, the Korean War, Missouri was recalled from the Atlantic Fleet and sent to the Pacific. There, it once again served as the headquarters for numerous admirals and senior officers overseeing operations and strategy. Missouri became the first American battleship to reach Korean waters. On its very first day of arrival, September 15, 1951, it immediately opened fire on Samchok to distract enemy forces from the landings at Incheon. This act marked a significant milestone in the history of the U.S. Navy, as for the first time since World War II, a major combat vessel fired its guns in combat against an enemy. The vigorous artillery salvos fired at that moment, combined with the actions of the cruiser Helena and 2 destroyers, created conditions for the successful advance of the U.S. Eighth Army. The powerful and seasoned combat ship continued to perform vital missions, often supporting combat operations across the Korean Peninsula. He served not only as a fire support vessel, but also as a command ship for some of the most important admirals involved in the war. Throughout the campaign, the Missouri repeatedly acted as a key support element, providing fire support for land and naval forces. Its last missile strike mission took place on March 25, 1953 in the Kojo area. The following day, during its final operation, its commander, Captain Warner Oldsill, suddenly lost consciousness from a heart attack while steering the ship through an underwater minefield barrier near Sabo. After that, the Missouri was replaced as the flagship of the 7th Fleet by its sister ship, the New Jersey, which had recently been recommissioned. Soon after having completed its service in Korea, the Missouri was decommissioned and taken out of service. However, its historical significance remained very high, and it was granted a special, extraordinary status. The vessel was moored off the coast of Brittany, west of Seattle, Washington, and became a popular tourist attraction. Millions of visitors from around the world came to see the famous surrender deck, the place where Japan refused to continue the war and signed the surrender, bringing World War II to an end. In the summer of 1984, as part of Reagan administration's program to build a fleet of 600 combat ships, the Missouri was relaunched and transported to the Long Beach Naval Base for modernization. This famous American battleship was equipped with the most advanced technology of the time. 4 Mark 14 missile launchers for Harpoon missiles, intended for destroying enemy ships, were installed. Additionally, 8 armored Mark 14 missile launchers for 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles were added, along with 4 Phalanx automatic guns designed to defend against enemy missiles and aircraft. All radar and fire control systems were fully upgraded, and new electronic systems were installed on the ship. To prepare for potential conflicts during the Cold War, the Missouri was equipped with the ANSLQ-25 electronic countermeasure system. Designed to use Nixie anti-submarine torpedoes to distract enemy missiles and explosive devices. The ship also received missile decoy launch systems intended to create false targets and confuse enemy missile systems. All of this made it truly combat-ready and prepared for battle. For the first time since its modernization, the Missouri raised its weapons in combat again. At dawn, at 1:40 a.m. on January 17, 1991, it launched a Tomahawk missile at targets in Iraq. This time, there was no one nearby to save the aging ship from final decommissioning and scrapping. As a result, this battleship was sent to the reserve fleet of the United States, where it remained idle and forgotten for 6 long years. Time passed, and the value of this vessel was suddenly recognized once more. In 1998, it was moved to Pearl Harbor, where the ship underwent a complete restoration and was transformed into a museum exhibit. Today, it stands at the USS Arizona Memorial, reminding visitors of the heroic deeds of those brave men and women whose lives were lost over 80 years ago in a distant war. During the last campaign in the Central Pacific in early 1945, the ship participated in the decisive Battle of Iwo Jima, as well as in the 5th Fleet's raids against Honshu and Nishoto Islands. Its aircraft struck the forces of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the East China Sea before facing the largest battleship in the world, the Yamato. This giant of the Japanese fleet took part in Japan's final major naval operation in the Pacific, protected by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers. Together, they moved to confront the combined Allied forces, aiming to prevent their military invasion of Okinawa. The Allied joint forces immediately attacked the Japanese convoy with all their strength, and as a result, despite all efforts, the cruiser, 4 destroyers, and Yamato sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese grew more desperate each day, and the successes of Bunker Hill drew the enemy's keen attention, fueling a thirst for revenge and prolonged fighting. This ship was laid down on September 23, 1941, at the Bethlehem Steel Company shipyard in Massachusetts, at the Four River Shipyard. It was assigned hull number 1509. It was one of 24 Essex-class aircraft carriers built specifically for the U.S. Navy during World War II. The ship's name was chosen in honor of the Battle of Bunker Hill, an important engagement of the American Revolutionary War. The ship was launched just over a year after its keel was laid, and in the summer of 1943, it was officially commissioned under the command of Captain J.J. Ballantyne. At the end of June, he took on board his air group at Norfolk, Virginia, and headed south to Trinidad for shakedown, a test voyage. 2 weeks later, the ship returned to Norfolk and prepared for active wartime service. On September 4th, it headed south through the Panama Canal toward its base in San Diego. There on the west coast, his path led to the harbor of Pearl Harbor and finally into the dangerous waters of the Pacific Ocean, where all the scale of military operations unfolded. In the following months, the ship participated in several battles scattered across the southwestern and central Pacific. As the struggle against the Imperial Japanese Empire reached its peak, this aircraft carrier became an integral part of the offensive against the Japanese homeland, taking part in fierce battles at Iwo Jima, on Okinawa Island, and in raids on mainland Japan. In early 1945, during the final months of the war, the Bunker Hill served as the flagship of the force group commanded by Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher. The entire Admiral's staff, including the Chief of Staff, was aboard. At 10 o'clock 5 minutes on the morning of May 20th, 1945, a fierce air combat erupted over the sea. At that moment, entire squadrons, 34 fighters, torpedo bombers, and bombers were preparing for takeoff on the deck, intended to support the assault on Okinawa. In the sky, after the enemy, Japanese fighters managed to hide behind thin layers of clouds, they suddenly appeared over the horizon. Suddenly, from the low-hanging clouds, a Japanese pilot, Second Lieutenant Tiso Yoshori, emerged. He quickly descended, heading toward the starboard side of the ship, and at the moment his plane was alongside the vessel, he dropped a massive 550-pound bomb onto the deck. The bomb pierced the sturdy deck plating and, soaring away, exploded over the water, leaving behind a bright flash and thick smoke. But the attack by the Japanese fighter was not over. The pilot, focused and determined not to give up his position, crashed directly into a fully fueled and armed aircraft standing on the deck. As a result of this terrible collision, the burning planes exploded, and their fuel and munitions triggered a chain reaction. Explosions, fire, and smoke engulfed the entire deck. This chaos caused the ship to begin rapidly breaking apart. Explosions and flames spread to the stern of the vessel, and the crew had to take urgent action. At that moment, one of the sailors, Second Lieutenant Joseph Carmichael Jr., took the initiative. He led rescue efforts, trying to keep the ship afloat and prevent complete destruction. Meanwhile, part of the crew, suffering heavy losses, was forced to jump overboard to escape the fire and smoke that filled the entire deck. Some sailors and airmen were wounded or burned. They were rescued by nearby ships, destroyers that arrived at the scene. Half a minute after the first strike, a second Japanese kamikaze fighter appeared in the sky. Like a shadow of death, it once again broke through the anti-aircraft fire and dropped another 550-pound bomb onto the deck. The explosion was so powerful that it destroyed the interior compartments, the hangar and the pilot's command post located below. As a result of this blast, 22 people died, members of the VF-84 squadron. After the precise hit, the pilot, following his combat instructions, headed toward the ship's bridge, the so-called island section, where the commanders and navigation services were located. However, he was unable to complete his mission. He crashed nearby, flying very close past the vice admiral and the fleet captain without hitting them. At the same time, the fighter's wings passed through the flag office zone, resulting in the deaths of 3 officers and 11 enlisted personnel who were part of the crew. Flames and burning smoke instantly engulfed the deck, causing new explosions and fires. The entire emergency response team was already on the scene, fighting the steadily spreading flames and trying to stop the chaos on board. Simultaneously, other specialists attempted to control the flooding that had begun underwater. The engineers on board worked under extremely difficult conditions, risking their lives, but they did not give up and continued the fight. At the most critical moment, the ship's chief engineer, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Carmichael Jr., took charge of the rescue and firefighting efforts. He clearly and firmly ordered the personnel in the rear engineering compartments to take action. Overall, 2 kamikaze-type ships, which struck the USS Bunker Hill in a short period of time, along with the subsequent fires, resulted in the heaviest casualties among the crew of all ships that survived the war, second only to the USS Enterprise. These tragic events had a profound impact on the fate of the ship and its crew, leaving a deep mark on naval history. The day after the attack, precisely 3 minutes past noon on May 20th, the USS Bunker Hill held the longest funeral ceremony in U.S. naval history. It was a special moment that would be remembered forever. The tradition of conducting such ceremonies dates back to ancient times, when it was vital to return fallen sailors to the depths of the ocean to ensure their peaceful and honorable passage into the sea. During World War II, many naval forces around the world practiced similar ceremonies, often even directly in combat zones, to honor the fallen. These rituals were usually brief and modest, so as not to distract the crew from their combat duties. However, in the case of the Bunker Hill, the ceremony lasted nearly 8 hours. So important was it to honor each of the fallen. Religious representatives attended the ceremony, including a rabbi, a Protestant minister, and a Catholic priest, who together recited prayers for the 352 people who lost their lives in this tragedy. Prayers were also offered for each of the 24 unidentified sailors by all 3 religious officials. Those who remained alive were on the deck almost the entire time, watching this solemn ritual, but many, overwhelmed and filled with emotion, moved away to experience this difficult moment alone. Suddenly, as a sign of respect and remembrance for the fallen, The Naval Honor Guard fired a salute of 21 shots, the so-called funeral salute. Afterwards, 6 coffins prepared for burial were lowered into the depths of the ocean, forever taking with them the bodies of those who could not return home. This somber and touching act was completed by dusk, and the tired, exhausted, and grieving crew prepared to return to their ship and continue their service. According to Ginsudi from the Naval History and Heritage Command, this ceremony was not only a tribute to the fallen, but also an expression of respect for the survivors, demonstrating resilience and patience during long and difficult hours to honor their comrades in their final journey. After a brief stop at Pearl Harbor, the Bunker Hill set sail back to the continental United States, heading to the shores of the mainland. Ultimately, it arrived at the Puget Sound Naval Base in Bremerton, Washington, where it underwent necessary repairs. At the same time, the crew received news that hostilities had finally ended. The soldiers and sailors were given the opportunity to go on leave and return home to their families. Bunker Hill was only used once more after that, during Operation Magic Carpet, which was carried out to bring American servicemen from the Pacific back to the mainland. Over the next few years, the ship made voyages from the West Coast to the Philippines, Guam, and Saipan. In October 1945, on Navy Day, Bunker Hill was opened for visits by residents of Seattle, Washington. By January of the following year, it was decommissioned, and a year later, it was fully stricken from the Naval Register. Despite the fact that during its service, the ship changed class 3 times and was reclassified as an auxiliary aircraft carrier. In mid-1973, it was finally dismantled and sent to the scrapyard. The last surviving aircraft carrier from the war, which once served in the fleet, was destroyed after an unsuccessful attempt to preserve it as a museum exhibit, as it was determined that restoring and maintaining it as a monument was too costly and complicated. Nevertheless, some memorabilia and materials from this ship have survived to this day. For example, 600 tons of steel armor plates from the pre-atomic energy era were used by the research laboratory Ferm Lab to create protective screens that prevent the penetration of ionizing particle background into their experiments. Part 27 of 45. These armor plates serve an important purpose in modern science, protecting equipment and ensuring the purity of results. However, not only materials from the ship find applications in new fields. For example, the protective shells used during its dry dock stay were later repurposed for the construction of a residential building in the state of Oregon, in the city of Westland. They were incorporated into a dome-shaped structure that became part of a modern residential complex. Moreover, the bell of the famous Bunker Hill ship was retrieved from scrap metal and displayed at the Aviation and Space Museum in San Diego, where it remained until 1986. That year, the bell was transferred to the ship's namesake, the cruiser Bunker Hill, which bore its name and served for 18 months during the Pacific War. For its heroic service, it was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation and received 11 battle stars, symbols of participation in combat. This ship participated in hostilities from the initial clashes in the Solomon Islands until it was disabled by one of the most destructive kamikaze attacks in naval history. In the early hours of June 26, 1942, the Romanian submarine Delfino raised the alarm after spotting 5 large warships heading toward the port of Constanța, a key strategic target on the western coast of the Black Sea. At that time, Romania had just joined the Nazi coalition and had begun striking Soviet airfields, destroying 47 bombers in a single mission. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet began its pursuit for revenge. Constanța was well fortified with Romanian air defense systems, and the coast was lined with powerful artillery batteries and ships. Additionally, 1,000 mines had been laid in the coastal waters to block all possible approaches to the port. The first wave of Soviet bombers attempted to break through to the port but failed. At 3:58 a.m., 2 destroyers, Moskva and Kharkov, shelled the port for 10 minutes, firing 350 shells. While the fire continued, a second wave of Soviet aircraft appeared on the scene. Then a pilot named Oria Agarici, representing the Romanian Air Force, took to the sky. He was piloting one of the most unusual aircraft ever involved in combat on the Axis side. It was a British Hawker Hurricane fighter, and what happened next is a story that Soviet and Allied sources have preferred to keep silent about. After World War I, Europe and the entire world underwent profound changes. Centuries-old empires and borders disappeared, giving way to a new world that shaped the 20th century. The treaty signed in the city of Brazil, along with a series of subsequent agreements, allowed the Romanians to annex territories such as Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transylvania. These territorial acquisitions were not only about expanding land, they also meant gaining control over important access routes to the sea. The significant increase in the coastline during World War II made control over strategic sites and territories a key factor determining the outcome of the entire struggle. Holding an important military position provided a substantial advantage. It allowed free movement of troops and supplies, the organization of naval operations, and the security of borders. In this context, control over ports, especially large and well-protected ones, became particularly significant. Romania, for several decades since gaining independence, sought to strengthen its positions and expand its territories. However, after territorial disputes with Hungary and the Soviet Union, the country lost large areas of land that had belonged to it just a few decades earlier. Soviet troops occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, which caused the Romanian leadership to feel vulnerable and worried about their security. During this period, Germany's role grew, promising to restore lost territories and increasing its influence in the Eastern European region. All this led Romania, sensing the threat from the Soviet Union and recognizing the importance of its geopolitical position, to decide to join the Axis powers. The port of Constanța held particular strategic importance for Romanian planners. It was one of the largest and busiest seaports in the country. This port served as a crucial gateway to Eastern Europe, through which a large volume of cargo and military ships passed. Therefore, Romania, in alliance with its new partner, Germany, began actively preparing to defend this strategic asset. Soon after the signing of the Tripartite Pact in November 1940, German military forces began implementing plans to strengthen the port's defenses. It was decided to create a robust defensive system capable of reliably protecting the country's entry point and ensuring the security of this strategic location. An important element of this system was the installation of a battery in Turița, an artillery complex located south of Constanța. It served as the main bastion of the port's defense. The focus was on 3 heavy guns with a caliber of 28 centimeters, model SKL-45, which were taken from World War I times. These guns represented powerful weaponry, capable of effectively countering any enemy ships or landings. Their operation was overseen by 700 naval personnel from the Greek army, a unit directly commanded by Romanian military authorities. To enhance protection and prevent possible attacks, additional minefields were laid, anti-aircraft guns installed, and patrol ships deployed to monitor any attempts at breach or attack by the Soviet Union. At that time, the situation in the region was changing rapidly. Just weeks before the attack on Constanța, the entire political and military landscape in Eastern Europe was beginning to take on a new sharpness. Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, was planning a large-scale military operation, Operation Barbarossa, which would become the largest offensive in human history. As part of this operation, German forces intended to cross the borders of the Soviet Union to seize its territories and weaken Soviet influence in Europe. This campaign was meant to significantly expand Germany's territory and increase its influence. But at the same time, it posed a risk to all participants, German troops and their allies. The Soviet Union closely monitored the actions of the Axis powers, especially the strengthening of the port of Constanța, an essential hub in the Black Sea. For Soviet leaders, this port was not only a strategic object, but also a symbol of control over the Black Sea. They sought to break the illusion of Axis dominance in the region, hoping to strike at their positions and restore the balance of power. When Hitler informed the Romanian authorities about the start of Operation Barbarossa, the leadership of the Romanian Navy and Army took measures to protect their interests. The first step was to deploy minefields in the waters. 3 Romanian mine ships, Amiral Morgescu, Regele Carol the Merge, and Aurora, were dispatched. On the 23rd anniversary of their service in the Navy, ships and naval forces across the country prepared for an important operation in the Black Sea. The main task was to support and guard the bombers heading to the strategic port of Buzău. In anticipation of this critical mission, all forces were brought to combat readiness, and crews prepared to carry out their tasks. Among them was Lieutenant Oria Agarasi, a young and ambitious pilot eager to join his unit and contribute to the upcoming battle. He listened intently to the briefing, hoping to hear that his aircraft was already ready for combat, but was informed that his fighter was under repair due to engine failure and would not be able to participate in the sortie for now. At the same time, the only other fighter, the Garakan, was also taken out of service due to reports of engine overheating, making it unavailable for combat missions. Despite this, the overall attack plan was successfully executed. Combat ships, supported by aviation, struck the enemy, destroying 37 Soviet aircraft before they could even take off. When the first reports of the battle reached Mamaia, the young and excited Agarasi eagerly awaited the chance to prove himself. He dreamed of his first combat success and was ready to do everything to achieve it. Soviet forces responded very quickly. The next day, 4 Tupolev Tu-12 light bombers and 4 Il-3 bombers took off into the Black Sea. Their task was to strike at the port of Constanza. However, the initial waves of attack carried out by aircraft from the 9th Bomber Aviation Regiment and the 2nd Mine Layer and Fueling Regiment did not yield significant results. They failed to inflict substantial damage on the port infrastructure, and it seemed that the enemy's efforts were in vain. But as the dust settled, a distinctive hum was heard from afar. New aircraft were approaching. This indicated that the second wave of Soviet bombers was already on its way. Despite engine overheating problems, at Agarasi's urgent request, he was allowed to take off on the remaining Hurricane fighter. He understood that his plane could not withstand a prolonged fight, so he acted quickly and decisively. In just 1 minute, Agarasi managed to shoot down 3 enemy aircraft. However, engine overheating ultimately forced him to make an emergency landing, and he had to leave the battle. As a result, he was sidelined from further combat operations, and everyone wondered, how many more enemies could he have shot down if his aircraft had been more reliable and powerful? Meanwhile, the crews of the 2 Soviet planes he shot down were forced to land their aircraft and were taken prisoner. The 3rd plane crashed into the Black Sea, and its crew went missing. This feat made Agarasi the first pilot to shoot down 3 enemy aircraft in a single combat sortie. This victory spread widely across Romania, and he was regarded by the people as a true hero. The country's authorities did not remain on the sidelines and used him as an example for propaganda. They even wrote a song dedicated to his bravery and skill. For his achievements, he was awarded the 3rd-class Medal for Aviation Valor, received the title of Knight in the Order of the Crown, and was awarded the Iron Cross of Germany. Additionally, he was promoted to the rank of captain. The Soviet forces, in turn, drew conclusions from the event and revised their strategy. The commander of the Black Sea Fleet, Vice Admiral Philip Octabi, developed a new plan of action. The next strike on the port of Constanza was to be carried out not only from the air. Soviet forces felt intense pressure from multiple sides, and a successful attack could significantly change the situation. Such a raid should have been coordinated so that if the first assault group succeeded, an enemy landing force would already be on standby, ready to quickly seize and control the port. At this time, at midnight and 30 minutes, an approaching enemy ship was spotted from the east, a Romanian Royal Navy submarine named NMS Delfino. Upon receiving the warning of the impending threat, the Romanian armed forces, the Marines from Crete, and the entire port prepared for immediate defense and possible combat. By 1:38 a.m., the enemy assault group, led by commanding figures named Moskwa and Kharkov, had taken a strategic firing position, selecting the optimal point to launch their strikes. From a distance of approximately 15 miles, they began shelling the railway station within the palace and port infrastructure, causing significant damage. In just 10 minutes, they fired about 350 shells, igniting a fire on a freight train carrying ammunition and several oil tanks, which were instantly engulfed in flames. However, thanks to timely intelligence about the approaching enemy from the submarine NMS Delfino, Romanian forces were able to prepare and avoid falling into the enemy's trap. Meanwhile, strategically positioned near Cape Tuzla, the destroyers NMS Regina Murat and NMS Mari took their stations, executing precise and coordinated fire on their targets. Operating at roughly 15 miles distance, they confirmed their combat readiness and accuracy, repeating their command orders flawlessly. As dawn broke over Constance, the enemy ships, creating a clear silhouette on the horizon, made it easier for defenders to aim their guns and fire. At the same time, the enemy vessels, thanks to their color and shape blending seamlessly with the Tuzla background, posed difficulties for the opponent's targeting, leading to shooting errors. In response, the Romanian ships Regina, Maria, and Marasi launched a powerful counterattack, delivering strong blows to the enemy. During the exchange of fire, Kharkov received several hits, and Moskva lost his main mast and sustained serious damage. German coastal batteries, operated effectively and precisely by the Marine infantry from Crete, joined the fight, increasing pressure on the Soviet fleet and further complicating the enemy ship's situation. In an attempt to regroup and retreat, Moskva began a slow withdrawal eastward. However, this movement contained a tragedy. Due to navigational errors, the already damaged ship found itself trapped in a minefield laid near Constanza several days earlier. A sudden, deafening explosion tore the ship in two, after which it rapidly sank, becoming an underwater grave for more than 300 sailors. Of the crew, numbering 400, only 79 were rescued. The rest perished or remained in the icy waters of the Black Sea. Overhead at that time, bombers from the Soviet Black Sea Fleet's aviation group, part of the 63rd Marine Aviation Brigade, attempted to compensate for the ineffectiveness of ground and naval forces. They took off from a base in Saki on the Crimean Peninsula, split into four groups. One headed toward Constanza, while the others targeted the areas around Salina, Bucharest, and the Danube Delta. The enemy's anti-aircraft defense in Constanza proved to be so strong that one of the bomber groups, according to reports, was forced to drop their bombs directly into the water to avoid coming under heavy fire. The unexpected effectiveness of this chaos and confusion was punctuated by an explosion once again. This time another mine detonated, causing serious damage to the cruiser belonging to Commander Rachilov. This raid on the port of Constanza did not achieve its main goal, to completely paralyze the port and its defenses. Despite the enemy's efforts, supported by German allies, Romanian forces managed to repel the attack, which was carried out along several fronts simultaneously. Their naval, aerial, and artillery defensive positions proved to be strong enough not to give way easily to the enemy. As a result, the morale of the Romanian troops was significantly boosted. The defensive plans and heroic actions of individual commanders and soldiers, such as Lieutenant Oria Agarici, became widely recognized and admired. The victory in defending the port of Constanza turned into a vivid symbol of resilience and resistance in the face of Soviet aggression. During these days, stories about the heroism of specific individuals spread widely, how they risked their lives to save the port and its strategic importance. Overall, the success of the port's defense demonstrated the high combat readiness of the Romanian armed forces and served as an example for the entire country. However, despite these achievements, the battle also revealed vulnerabilities. The minefields, which proved highly effective in sinking the Soviet cruiser Moskva, also created significant navigational problems. Even for Romanian ships, ensuring safe passage through the minefields and preventing similar fates for their own vessels was crucial. Therefore, it became clear to the command that routes needed to be carefully monitored and that accidental collisions should be avoided. For Soviet sailors and commanders, this attack served as a harsh lesson. Soon after the battle, they were ordered not to discuss what had happened in order to preserve morale and not to undermine combat spirit. The surviving sailors and commanders were forced to keep the details of the incident secret, as even rumors of such a heavy defeat could negatively affect the fighting morale of the entire army. The loss of Moskva, the flagship, was a significant blow to the Soviet naval forces and instilled a sense of vulnerability. Vice Admiral Philip Okiki, commander of the Black Sea Fleet, began re-evaluating the strategy and tactics of his forces. Inspired by this event, the Soviet command leaders decided to focus on more covert and indirect methods of warfare. In particular, they paid special attention to the development of submarines to use them for striking at the enemy's vulnerable supply lines and disrupting maritime supply routes. Additionally, nighttime bombings became one of the preferred methods of attack, as it allowed for the element of surprise and helped avoid the powerful daytime defensive systems guarding vital targets such as the port of Constanza. During this time, the German fleet continued to improve. Admiral Scheer, one of the three pocket battleship-type ships built in Germany before Adolf Hitler came to power, once again powered up his engines and resourcefully headed into battle. His target was to attack a convoy of 38 merchant ships protected by escort vessels. This ship boasted impressive speed, over 52 kilometers per hour, as well as armament consisting of 6 28-centimeter guns. For a short time, it posed a significant threat that had to be taken seriously. However, its rapid advance was suddenly interrupted when one of the merchant ships, having broken away from the convoy, unexpectedly turned directly toward the German battleship. This maneuver was incredibly risky and even dangerous for the crew's lives. Nevertheless, the crew of the small transport vessel HMS Jervis Bay, converted from a regular merchant ship, decided not to retreat and was willing to sacrifice itself to save the entire convoy. They knew they risked their lives, but their goal was to protect it. After several years of meticulous research and lengthy negotiations with the United Kingdom, France, and the United States in 1928, the management of Rex Marine Shipbuilding Company approved the project for the first Deutschland-class ship. Subsequently, 3 similar vessels were built, the ship named Deutschland, as well as 2 others, the Admiral Scheer and Admiral Grabe. These ships were classified as Panzerschiffe, or armored cruisers. However, despite these official designations, Britain decided to call them pocket battleships due to their powerful armament and substantial armor protection. Although these ships were relatively light in weight, all were equipped with 6 powerful 28-centimeter guns capable of penetrating any armored target. Their main purpose was to be able to surpass any enemy cruiser in firepower that could approach and open fire. In other words, if pocket battleships could not catch a fast-moving opponent, they could still outgun it from a distance and destroy it. The ship named Admiral Scheer was named after Prussian Admiral Reinhard Scheer, who commanded the German fleet on the open sea during the famous Battle of Jutland in World War I. The German government ordered the construction of this vessel at Rex Marine Shipyard in Wilhelmshaven. The launch took place on April 1, 1933. The ship was named after Admiral Scheer, with his daughter Marianne Besser serving as godmother. The fully completed construction of the ship was finished exactly 1 year later, on November 12, 1934. The ship's length was over 186 meters, with a width of about 22 meters and a maximum draft of 7 meters 25 centimeters. This pocket battleship had a displacement of 13,340 tons and, when fully loaded, could reach a weight of 15,200 tons. The crew consisted of 30 officers and nearly 1,500 sailors. The main armament of the vessel included 6 23-centimeter guns, arranged in 2 triple-gun turrets, one at the front and one at the rear. As auxiliary armament, the ship was equipped with 8 15-centimeter guns mounted in single turrets. Admiral Scheer's armor initially included 6 18.8-centimeter gun mounts, which during World War II were replaced with 6 10.5-centimeter guns. Additionally, the ship carried 28 200mm automatic flak guns, as well as 4 30mm C-30 model guns, significantly enhancing its defense capabilities and effectiveness against aerial targets. Later, 2 Arad Arminus 196 SE planers and a catapult designed for launching these aircraft were installed on board. To combat at sea and defend against torpedo attacks, the ship was equipped with 2 torpedo tubes with a diameter of 53 centimeters located at the stern. The ship's belt armor varied in thickness from 6 to 8 centimeters, providing reliable protection against enemy shells. The upper deck was only 17 millimeters thick, while the main guns were protected by armor over 140 millimeters thick. The power plant consisted of 8 9-cylinder engines, which could achieve a maximum speed of over 52 kilometers per hour. As a result, the ship had a range of about 16,000 kilometers without refueling. Although their role at that time did not involve active combat, Admiral Scheer and the Deutsch-Seeland ship were attacked by Spanish Republican aircraft off the coast of Ibiza on May 29, 1937. In response, just a day later, Admiral Scheer opened fire on the port of Almeria, delivering a strike. Nearly a year had passed since the ship first appeared off the Spanish coast, and eventually its command decided to replace it with a more modern vessel. As a result, Admiral Scheer was handed over to his sister, Admiral Grabe, and returned to Germany for further service. After some time following the start of World War II and the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, Admiral Scheer remained in the port of Wilhelmshaven, awaiting orders. He was there with the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, preparing for possible further actions. However, on September 4th, British Bristol Blenheim bombers attacked both ships. Several bombs hit Admiral Scheer's deck, but fortunately did not explode. At the same time, the ship's anti-aircraft guns managed to shoot down one enemy aircraft, while the remaining four were destroyed during the second raid, which was repelled thanks to quick reaction and combat readiness of German defenses. This became a sort of baptism by fire for the ship, its first combat test. Soon after, the cruiser was modernized and converted into a so-called raider, a ship designed to disrupt enemy trade routes. This approach aligned with Admiral Rader's strategy, which aimed to interfere with Allied convoys rather than engage directly with the superior forces of the Royal Navy. Under the command of Captain Theodore Crank, Admiral Scheer was sent to the Atlantic in October 1940 to strike at convoys passing through these waters. He cautiously navigated through the Arctic Ocean to avoid encounters with British ships, only then passing through the Denmark Strait. During a fierce storm that swept two crew members overboard, Captain Crank received important intelligence. A large British convoy, codenamed HX Sewell, had departed from Halifax, Nova Scotia. The convoy consisted of 38 merchant ships escorted by the converted merchant vessel HMS Jervis Bay, which was armed solely with 6-inch guns from World War I, and nothing more. Every day, Captain Crank sent his two hydroplanes, the Aris C, to locate the convoy, until finally on November 5, 1940, it was spotted. When Admiral Scheer's crew saw the convoy, all weapons and personnel rushed to battle stations to prepare for combat. At that moment, HMS Jervis Bay and its commander, Captain Edward Fagan, displayed courage and resilience despite their modest armament. They resisted the British ship for more than 22 minutes, although unable to stop it. Ultimately, Jervis Bay was sunk, but during that time, it managed to buy enough time for most of the convoy's ships to escape. Admiral Scheer opened fire with his guns, rapidly gaining speed to catch up with the convoy and inflict maximum damage. His guns relentlessly fired, and the engines roared, trying to catch and destroy him. In April, the second squadron of ships, known as a pocket cruiser, or in other words, a small battleship, set out once again, returning to the port of Kiel after a long and intense combat raid across the Atlantic Ocean. This raid, covering approximately 85,000 kilometers, resulted in significant losses for the enemy. 17 Allied merchant ships were sunk, with a total tonnage exceeding 114,000 tons. This success confirmed Admiral Scheer's effectiveness, demonstrating his ability to operate successfully as a naval raider and inflict substantial damage on the enemy's merchant fleet. Sometime later, in February 1942, Admiral Scheer again took to the sea, participating in an operation codenamed Russell Spring. The goal of this operation was to disrupt the trade routes of the Allied nations off the coast of Norway, making supplies more difficult and weakening the enemy. Soon after, as part of another operation called Wonderland, the ship launched a raid into the Kola Bay with the aim of attacking Soviet vessels operating in the area. In August 1942, the pocket cruiser once again demonstrated its combat resilience. It sank the Soviet icebreaker, Cyberakov, and conducted artillery shelling of the port of Dixon, striking Soviet positions and ships. Afterward, to recover and carry out necessary repairs, the ship was sent to Germany. There at the shipyard, it underwent repairs and preparations for new combat missions. In November 1944, to support the advance of its Allied forces against Soviet air, land, and sea units, the pocket cruiser was relocated to the island of Ozzel. This operation was a vital part of the overall plan, and the ship became one of the means of supporting combat actions in that sector. In February of the following year, 1945, Admiral Scheer headed to the ports of Kaliningrad and Pisa to strike at Soviet positions and hinder their resistance on the ground. However, the constant artillery fire from the ship during these operations severely wore down its guns. They began to malfunction and required urgent repairs. Therefore, without delay, the ship was sent back to Kiel to receive the necessary assistance and restore its combat readiness. Yet already on April 9, 1945, fate once again brought it into danger. On that day, during a bombing raid by the Royal Air Force, the cruiser was attacked by a powerful wave of airstrikes. It was hit by several explosive casings, and as a result, the ship was heavily damaged and lost stability, eventually capsizing and sinking. After Germany's capitulation, the ship was dismantled for scrap. Despite the damage, its hull remained largely intact, and ultimately it was sold for scrap. Today, after completing all the work on filling the inner harbors and constructing new port facilities, the remains of this ship rest beneath the waters off the coast of Kiel. They remain there as a reminder of those bloody and difficult times. In early October, on the 25th day of 1944, when the Allies began active operations to retake the Philippines, the American forces made a serious mistake that could have changed the course of events. They were deceived by the cunning Japanese plans, and the Americans found themselves completely unprepared for a major naval battle in the Pacific, for the first time during the war. As a result, the American Third Fleet was diverted to a false objective and engaged in a futile pursuit of Japanese ships, creating ideal conditions for Japanese forces. At that moment, Japanese ships located east of Samar Island had free access to the landing craft. On them loomed the Japanese super battleship Yamato, the greatest and most powerful combat vessel in the history of naval battles. This colossal ship was armed with massive guns capable of firing enormous shells that reached a range of over 15 miles. One such shell could destroy any ship in Sprague's squadron. This colossal warship, in terms of size and firepower, surpassed all other vessels in its fleet, making it a truly invincible monster of naval combat. In addition to Yamato, 3 other large warships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers quickly approached the American squadron. All of this created a very dangerous situation, as the Japanese ships clearly outnumbered and outgunned the Americans. In contrast, the armament of the Taffy III ships consisted of medium-sized guns operated by crews more suited for fighting aircraft and light armor, such as surface submarines. Submarines surfaced to the surface. The sailors of Taffy III were significantly weaker in firepower and outgunned, but they could not escape from the Japanese ships. The closer the Japanese cruisers approached, the faster the American destroyers released thick black smoke to conceal their aircraft carriers from enemy targeting fire, which could easily destroy the defenseless carriers like paper. At this most perilous moment, the destroyer USS Johnston suddenly emerged from the smokescreen. This 15,000-ton ship was commanded by Captain Ernest E. Evans, a Cherokee Native American who had promised never to retreat before the Japanese. On the contrary, Captain Evans decided to take a risky move, sacrificing one ship, and charged directly into the ranks of heavily armed Japanese vessels. With zigzagging maneuvers, he navigated through the dense fire of 23 enemy ships, understanding that one precise hit could end his crew's lives. Fortunately, he was not alone. Part 38 of 45. 6 squadrons of American fighter bombers flew over the destroyer, cutting through a hail of tracer rounds and shrapnel, destroying the enemy with everything they had. Despite everything, this brave ship managed to approach the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, one of its main foes. It fired all 5 of its guns at the massive vessel, launching 200 shells in just 5 minutes. Remarkably, it managed to destroy the gun emplacements and then launched a series of 10 torpedoes that literally tore Kumano apart. After exhausting all its torpedoes, Johnston turned back toward Taffy III, continuing to bombard the enemy with hundreds of shots at anything bearing the rising sun emblem on its side. But finally, its luck ran out. Ultimately, USS Johnston was struck by a direct hit from the ship Congo. The enemy shell pierced the hull, destroying the boiler and significantly reducing the vessel's speed. Additionally, one of the heavy cruiser's shells ignited an ammunition magazine for the anti-aircraft guns, causing explosions and scattering shrapnel across several decks. Another shell fired by an enemy directly hit the bridge, breaking the mast and destroying communication and radar systems. Captain Evans was wounded, losing 2 fingers and suffering serious injuries from shrapnel, but he continued to give orders and steer the ship. Amid the chaos of the battle, the crews of the Avengers and Hellcats continued their attack. This clever maneuver confused the Japanese and bought the American fleet precious time to retreat and escape. Based on Johnston's bold actions, the remaining destroyers Herman Hall and Samuel B. Roberts charged through dense smoke and dust clouds into the fight, risking everything to save themselves. Among the ships of the Taffy's 3rd Squadron, Roberts stood out for its small size, sluggishness, weak armament, and almost complete lack of armor. While the second wave of attacking ships, smaller and more lightly armed, reached torpedo range, they sailed past the damaged Johnston, which, barely moving, was slowly returning to its aircraft carriers. Its captain, Evans, stood on the deck in full combat readiness, saluting the passing destroyers that, despite obvious danger in an almost hopeless situation, rushed toward almost certain death. Clenching his teeth, he ordered his ship to turn back and re-engage in battle to help his comrades. Meanwhile, the other American destroyers, full of resolve, headed straight into the heart of the Japanese column. Armed with powerful anti-aircraft and anti-submarine guns, while Johnston, despite all its damage, continued to cover its allies with fire from its 5-inch guns, targeting enemy artillery and torpedo boats remaining in its range. At the same time, Hall launched torpedoes at the battleship Congo, but without much success, and then shifted to training volleys against the Imperial cruiser Haguro. Meanwhile, Germans struck 4 Japanese battleships, firing 54-pound shells from her 5-inch guns, and then turned toward the main target, the Imperial ship Yamamoto. She launched torpedoes in its direction, forcing the battleship to change course, while Roberts, joining the fight, attacked the heavy cruiser Chokai with torpedoes and close-range gunfire. However, Captain Evans noticed a troubling phenomenon: a group of 5 Japanese destroyers ready to attack the U.S. aircraft carriers. His ship was the only one capable of resisting them. Without hesitation, he ordered Johnstone to move forward and break into the enemy formation, despite numerical superiority, 5 against 1, and the fact that the opponents were better armed. Evans did not stop, opening fire on the enemy in panic and desperately trying to steer Japanese torpedoes off course. Against all odds, he managed to divert part of the Japanese column from the correct path, distracting their targeting and causing torpedoes to miss their target. During the fierce artillery battle, 2 destroyers, Dennis Raymond and John S. Butler, joined Johnstone. They opened fire on the enemy, doing everything possible to distract the Japanese ships and prevent them from reaching the aircraft carriers. While German was engaged in close-range combat with 2 heavy cruisers, Hall fought for her life against 3 warships, and Roberts fired with such intensity that he expended about 600 shells in an hour. Despite heavy damage, Roberts managed to hit the heavy cruiser Chokai, significantly weakening the enemy. Surprisingly, the small American squadron not only held its ground, but even began to gain the upper hand. Over the next hour, intense fighting continued without pause, and the situation gradually worsened. Despite German and her escorts being under constant fire from powerful ships, battleships and cruisers, and ultimately being hit by the Japanese ship Congo, 3 14-inch shells tore through her stern, destroying the engine and artillery installations and disabling her navigation system. Nevertheless, the ship continued to fight. She had to fire manually because her electronic equipment was damaged, and she launched her final torpedo salvos at the cruiser Haguro. The hit was precise, and the explosion destroyed the lower decks of the cruiser, forcing it to withdraw from the battle. But Gallus herself was in a very dire situation. Most of her armament was either out of ammunition or damaged and unable to fire anymore. She could no longer evade enemy attacks. In 1 hour of battle, Gallus received 40 hits and was completely destroyed. The captain ordered the crew to abandon ship, but the artillerymen refused to surrender. They remained at their positions, continuing to fire even as the ship began to sink. Only after an enemy shell exploded, the ammunition supplies where they stopped. Soon, the Roberts, another American ship, was also hit. 3 powerful armor-piercing shells forced the captain's crew to abandon the ship, bringing their heroic struggle to an end. A unique and tragic situation occurred on the aircraft carrier Gambier Bay. It was the only case in history where an American aircraft carrier was sunk by surface fire. During the battle, it was struck by 15 enemy shells, yet it continued to stay afloat. In addition, all other escort ships, despite the danger, kept their desperate run to the safe zone thanks to brave destroyers that sacrificed themselves to save the other vessels. These destroyers successfully avoided a second enemy torpedo attack, largely thanks to courageous pilots who, firing machine guns, engaged the enemy while reaching speeds of about 200 miles per hour. In another part of the battle, the ship Johnston fought its last fight, opening fire in all directions, surrounded by 4 destroyers that ruthlessly tore apart its superstructure. Its guns were destroyed and its engines flooded, prompting Captain Evans to order the ship to abandon. Johnston disappeared from sight and was never seen again. While the Japanese destroyers retreated, their crews came onto the decks and saluted the American sailors who fought and remained in the water. In this fierce clash, lasting about 2.5 hours, the Americans lost 4 ships: the destroyers Johnston and Gallus, the minesweeper Samuel B. Roberts, and the aircraft carrier Gambier Bay. At the same time, the Japanese, starting the battle with a much more powerful force, suffered similar losses. 2 heavy cruisers, Chokai and Chikuma, were heavily damaged. 2 others, Kimano and Suzuya, received serious damage, and the battleship Haruma was destroyed and rendered inoperable. Admiral Teo Kurita, realizing that the cost of losses was too high and observing the approach of fresh reinforcements, decided to cease the fight. The Taffy 3 group somehow held its own against the largest fleet in history, a total of 6 aircraft carriers and 7 destroyers. In the end, this brave crew lost 792 men in battle, and another 668 were wounded. Despite enormous difficulties and incredible losses, they managed to accomplish their mission. The entire combat-ready part of the German fleet was awarded a high honor: the Presidential Memorial Certificate for Meritorious Service, and Captain Evans was posthumously awarded the most prestigious honor, the Medal of Honor. This award became a testament to the heroism and self-sacrifice demonstrated during the fierce battle off the coast of Samara, where the fate of the ships was decided literally on the brink of life and death. At the same time, Admiral Kurita was confident that he was engaging with large ships, aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers of the American fleet, which accompanied the major warships. He could not even imagine that he was actually facing smaller units, half the strength of what he expected to encounter. This misjudgment of the enemy's forces played a role in the battle, which turned out to be one of the most intense and memorable in naval history. Germany at that period was taking its first steps toward building new warships capable of competing with British and French armored aircraft carriers. However, the main difficulty was that all these ships were constructed under strict limitations imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty. This treaty set strict constraints on the size, displacement, and armament of ships, greatly limiting the possibilities for creating truly powerful war vessels. As a result, even the largest German ships, such as the Scharnhorst class, were significantly weaker than what would be expected for ships of their size. The Scharnhorst was armed with an 11-inch gun and 12 guns of about 5.5 inches caliber. The ship was laid down in June 1930 and completed only in October 1939. Usually, the Scharnhorst operated alongside its sister ship, Gneisenau, and their joint raids along routes used by Allied convoys supplying the Soviet Union caused considerable damage. After German ships successfully sank several British merchant vessels in the Atlantic and Northern Europe, the British command launched active searches and pursuits of German ships. However, the Scharnhorst was not willing to surrender without a fight. In December 1943, the Battle of North Cape took place. This was the last major engagement between large British and German warships with heavy armament. This battle was not only the final clash of such ships, but also one of the last battles between battleships in the entire war. To sink the Scharnhorst, more than 14 heavily armed ships were required, clearly demonstrating its high combat capability and resilience. After the end of World War I, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the development of the German military fleet was strictly limited. Germany had to reduce its army to 100,000 men, which was insufficient for the full defense of the country. These restrictions particularly affected the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. The Allies prohibited Germany from owning or building dreadnought-type ships, which were considered the largest and most powerful warships of World War I. All naval equipment could only be modernized, not improved, and the weight of such ships was not to exceed 10,000 tons, roughly equivalent to a heavy cruiser of the British fleet. These strict restrictions made Germany virtually defenseless in the event of an attack by the victors. Despite this, German engineers and naval officers did not give up and sought ways to circumvent these limitations. They developed a new concept, so-called pocket battleships, small in size but quite powerful vessels. The average displacement of such ships was about 12,000 tons, and their armament included 2 triple turrets with 11-inch guns. These ships were not intended for frontline combat, but for other strategic purposes. During the time of significant events in Germany, the country's leader, known as the Führer, actively approved new initiatives originating from the armed forces and provided all necessary contracts and privileges for the development of various industries. He was fully focused on restoring the strength of the German armed forces, starting literally from zero to bring back the former grandeur that the country was known for in the past. This large-scale plan was part of his strategy to make Germany a global superpower again, capable of resisting any challenges and becoming one of the leading forces on the world stage. At a time when the German people, despite everything, continued to believe in and support their leader, the Third Reich government began negotiations to sign an agreement with Great Britain regarding naval forces. This agreement allowed the country to build larger and more powerful ships, which had previously been restricted. Permission to construct such vessels was granted because most leading world powers, including Japan, had already begun creating stronger and more combat-ready ships. In 1935, as part of the fleet's renewal and expansion, the first two ships of the new era were laid down, ships that symbolized the revival of Germany's naval potential. They were named Harthorst and Hannesana, in honor of two armored cruisers that were sunk by the Royal Navy during the Battle of the Fallens, near Argentina in the early days of World War I. These names also honored two Prussian generals considered founders of the Prussian army during the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century. The first ship, Harthorst, was laid down in June 1935 and launched in October of the following year at the naval shipyard in Wilhelmshaven. Construction was completed in January 1939, just a few months before Germany decided to invade Poland. This large vessel, serving as the flagship, had a displacement of 32,110 tons at rest and reached 48,000 tons when fully loaded. It was 235 meters long, 30 meters wide, and drew nearly 10 meters of water, part 43 of 45. The movement was powered by three Brown Bavarian sea-geared steam turbines, which provided over 158,000 horsepower, allowing the ship to reach a maximum speed of about 58 kilometers per hour. Such a vessel could travel up to 16,000 kilometers without refueling, making it highly mobile and strategically important. The main armament of the Harthorst consisted of 9 11-inch guns, arranged in 3 triple turrets. The forward turrets were named Anton and Bruno, while the aft turret was called Caesar. Compared to battleships of other nations, the armament of this cruiser was somewhat lighter. Instead of the standard 14 or 15-inch guns, it was equipped with 11-inch guns. This choice was made under Hitler's direct orders, who believed that more powerful weapons would attract unnecessary attention from European neighbors. The Führer promised that the ship would be upgraded in the future with 15-inch guns installed, but this prospect was never realized. As secondary armament, the ship was equipped with 12 guns of approximately 5.5 inches caliber. To combat aerial targets, 14 Flak 38 automatic cannons and 16 SKC-30A guns were mounted on board. The cruiser's armor belt was 350 millimeters thick, providing good protection. The armored deck initially had a thickness of 40 millimeters, but in the area of the side connections and at the base, it was reinforced. During one of its combat missions, the Scharnhort successfully sank the British merchant cruiser Rawalpindi. This was an important event that demonstrated the strength and resolve of the German ship. Months later, in January 1940, during the German invasion of Norway, the British battlecruiser Renown found itself in a dangerous situation. It clashed with Scharnhort and was forced to retreat, avoiding complete destruction. However, fate was less kind to another British ship, the aircraft carrier Glories, which was attacked and sunk near the Norwegian coast in June of the same year, despite being in the Norwegian area throughout the year. In the early months of 1940 and the early 20s, the command of the Scharnhort and its ally Gunneschau began a series of successful raids that resulted in significant enemy losses. Afterwards, both ships returned to the German-occupied French naval base in Brittany. By May 1941, Scharnhort and Gunneschau received orders to leave France to draw the attention of the Royal Navy and to allow the new battleship Bismarck to pass through the Denmark Strait to strike the enemy. However, Royal Air Force air attacks thwarted this operation and made the successful passage of Bismarck impossible. Meanwhile, Scharnhorst, Gunneschau, and several other ships managed to avoid danger and reach Germany in the following days. After that, throughout the entire 20th and 41st hours, Scharnhorst remained in Kiel, operating there almost without rest. During the entire 21st hour, he maintained combat readiness and preparedness for new engagements. By the 12th month of 1943, the ship set out again into Norwegian waters to attack convoys heading to the Soviet Union. In this raid, he operated in coordination with the submarine U-boat U-Boat, and their combined actions caused significant damage to the cargoes destined for Russia. On Christmas Eve, on the 24th night of December, Scharnhorst left Norwegian waters and pursued a British convoy. The British fleet had been warned of the German intentions, and in response, a special unit of ships was formed to stop the German hunter. This unit was divided into two parts. The first included the cruisers Norfolk, Belfast, and Sheffield, commanded by Admiral Robert Burnett. The second comprised 4 destroyers, the battleship Duke of York and the cruiser Jamaica, commanded by Admiral Bruce Fraser. As Scharnhorst approached Bear Island to attack the convoy, the British squadron was already there, laying an ambush. Admiral Eric Bay immediately ordered preparations for battle. At the start of the fight, Belfast was the first to strike the German ship, hitting its radar antenna. Then Norfolk fired, but its missiles did not cause significant damage. In response, Scharnhorst opened fire from his main guns, from the Caesar turret, and quickly turned south to escape from the enemy at maximum speed. 20 minutes later, Belfast and Norfolk rejoined and began firing again. In response, Scharnhorst opened fire from the aft turret, hitting Norfolk twice, destroying its radar station and damaging the turret. Admiral Bay ordered a sharp turn into retreat, but Duke of York was already on his tail and opened fire. As the battle grew more personal and fierce, the ship's commander, Shanho, decided to attempt to hit his British opponent. However, his 11-inch shells proved insufficiently powerful to disable the ship. The hours-long clash continued, and eventually another shell fired from the Duke of York penetrated the upper armor belt of the German vessel and exploded in the boiler room. The explosion significantly slowed the German ship and put it in a difficult position. Temporary repairs allowed Scharnhorst to slightly increase the distance from Duke of York, and the German crew managed to disable the British ship's fire control radar, complicating its further destruction. But despite these successes, the battle was not yet over. After 42 volleys had been fired, the Duke of York retreated, making way for the destroyers Scorpio and Storm, which prepared to launch 8 torpedoes. 4 of them hit their targets. 1 torpedo became lodged permanently in Bruno's turret, completely disabling it. Another damaged the shaft of the port propeller, significantly limiting the ship's maneuverability. A 3rd torpedo struck the bow, causing minor flooding. The 4th torpedo caused slight flooding in the lower compartments. While the Caesar gun was focused on the Duke of York, the British ships Jamaica and Belfast approached and launched additional torpedoes. After nearly a whole day of fierce combat, the Shanho began to gradually sink, eventually listing bow down. The debris from auxiliary guns was seen as a display of bravery and defiance by the British sailors, but soon they fell silent in the darkness. At that moment, the British ships turned on their searchlights to find survivors, managing to rescue only 36 men from a crew of 2,000. The water still emitted ominous sounds, but on the orders of the British commanders, the ships began to retreat and regroup. The sinking of the Shanho opened the way for the Royal Navy to breathe more easily and continue safely escorting convoys to Russia, as well as freeing some large ships for other missions. As for the German forces, their navy was never able to recover from this defeat, and its further development was effectively halted.